Okay.
Welcome, everyone. I'll give you a couple of minutes for everyone to join us on the Zoom session. So this is the conversation with Dr. Hanan Ashrawi. It's a pleasure to have her directly from Palestine. So we'll give a couple of minutes. I know that we have a few hundred people that are joining us in this conversation, which is very, very critical on many fronts. So while people are joining, I did put the full bio of Dr. Hanan Ashrawi on the chat, so you'll have access to the full biography. But just to give you the key components of it, Dr. Hanan Ashrawi is a distinguished Palestinian leader, legislator, activist, and scholar who served as a member of the leadership committee as an official spokesperson of the Palestinian delegation in the Middle East peace process, beginning with the Madrid Conference of 1991. And I had the pleasure to meet with Dr. Haidar Abdushafi and Dr. Hanan Ashrawi at the time during the Madrid Conference. But for those people, now it's long history. It's almost 30 years into the process. In 1996, Dr. Hanan Ashrawi was appointed as the Palestinian Authority Minister of Higher Education and Research. And prior to that, she was Dean of Faculty of Arts at Birzeit University and head of its Legal Aid Committee since the mid-1970s. I have a number of students from UC Berkeley that actually went to Birzeit University, both to study Arabic and to spend the time in studying Middle East, and I have some dear, dear friends that are really colleagues, continue to work and cooperate in areas of academic interest for Palestine. That's an area of my, again, as an academic, it's an area of both a love and concern. The Palestinian academics globally have made a profound imprint on academia, both at the local and the international level. Dr. Hanan Ashrawi was elected to the Palestinian Legislative Council, representing Jerusalem in 1996, and she was re-elected for the third wave bloc ticket in 2016. Dr. Hanan Ashrawi had many awards, many recognitions, and hopefully we'll be able to read all of those on the chat. So welcome. It's really a pleasure to have you with us via Zoom. And
thank you, Hatem.
Thank you. So I really wanted immediately to, as I was reading preparing to our conversation, I looked at the data that is coming from COVID-19 in Palestine, especially in the Khalil district. So could you give us just a reading of what is the situation looks like for the Palestinians with COVID-19 at this point?
Yes, thank you, Hatem, and thank you for your very kind introduction. It's good to be with you. Pleasure. So why don't you call me Hanan to save time?
I will do that.
Okay, great. No, the situation with COVID-19 is in many ways affected by the context, by the general situation we are in. Right now, we are on the second wave, as they say, but we never really had the first wave because it was very contained and people were very disciplined, and very frankly, the Palestinian Authority did a very good job in restricting the spread of the virus. Unfortunately, this time, with no Israeli cooperation or contact in any way, the coronavirus has spread and multiplied. We have, at first we had a few hundred, now we have close to 12,000, 11,980, mainly in Hebron and Khalil, as you said, but also in Jerusalem and in Ramallah and in all the major cities and areas and districts of the West Bank, as well as in Gaza. But Gaza is more limited because of the siege, the closure, as you know. But since the Palestinians are not in charge, we are not in charge of our crossing points, of our borders, of our airspace, territorial waters, we cannot close down, we cannot prevent people from coming and going. Israel is the one that is in control. That has created a situation where the porosity of the movement between Palestine and Israel is something that led to greater people coming in, particularly the workers who work in Israel. And Israel, as you know, has a very high rate of coronavirus, and most of them would come back with the virus. In addition, in Hebron, there is quite a bit of intermarriage in the villages and areas of Hebron with Palestinians, and especially in Bir Saba and Rahat and areas like that, where through family visits and so on, they ended up bringing in more coronavirus. And the problem is we cannot, we don't have an airport, we don't have free access, so we cannot bring in all the equipment that we need. In addition to the fact that, of course, the PA is almost bankrupt. There is no money coming in at all, and Israel is withholding our funds. So that the only medicine and testing equipment and so on that's coming comes from different countries who are donating to Palestine. So it's extremely difficult. You're not in control internally, freedom of movement, you have checkpoints and so on, you have Israeli incursions, you have Israeli arrests. They arrested somebody who had the coronavirus the other day. So they had to release him because they discovered that he did have the coronavirus and he had to be treated. Every time we set up a system for testing, I'm sure you've heard of this, in Silwan, we set up a system and the Israelis came and confiscated everything and disbanded and arrested the people who were doing this because they didn't want any Palestinian official to work in Jerusalem. And the same thing in Khalil, in Hebron. A very generous person donated his land to build on it a testing center and an isolation center for the coronavirus. And they came in, they waited till they finished building the place, and then they came in and they confiscated everything in it and they tore it down, they destroyed it as usual. So all these interventions, the very insidious ways in which the occupation affects our lives, has made the coronavirus much worse, and it has brought to the front all the handicaps that we have to live with and deal with as a result of this system of control by the Israeli occupation. They even confiscated food parcels. They even stopped people. They arrested people in Jerusalem who were distributing food parcels and medicines and so on. So that's one thing. But in addition, I mean, the overall situation is extremely drastic. And we're trying very hard to limit or contain it now. But conditions are not comforting, to put it that way, mildly.
Thank you. And I know that many people are watching that we have a number of nonprofit organizations that do direct aid for Palestine. So while we make sure that the political work is being done, I can't really overstate the direct need on the ground, both in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So I'm following the details on a daily basis, and I urge people to continue to support all the initiatives.
We're really worried about Gaza, because if it gets into Gaza, then as a very highly congested area, it's going to be hard to contain. But so far, it still has not exploded in Gaza. But other areas like refugee camps, for example, we are seeing now a rise in cases in refugee camps. This is very serious, particularly around Jerusalem and in Lebanon, for example. This is also serious. And the third area is the prisoners.
Sure.
Because the prisoners are kept in very unhygienic, healthy conditions. They don't have the proper care. And every once in a while we hear that one prison guard or one warden or whatever, or one prisoner has been diagnosed with COVID-19. So it's extremely serious, because we've been asking for the release in accordance with international humanitarian law.
Sure.
The release of prisoners. In other places they have. And we have 5,000 at least political prisoners in Israeli jails. And they are quite vulnerable. So this is, again, one segment of the population we are really worried about.
Right. I know that Zaina, your daughter, has joined us. She's online, and hopefully we'll try to ask her a question about her ID card that has been confiscated, which is another issue that we will deal with. But I really wanted to ask you a question that you were born in Nablus, and you were born during the Jordanian rule and then moved into the Israeli occupation. So just give us a short biography about just background, family.
I was born just before the establishment of the State of Israel. My father was a doctor in the Palestine Army, so he was stationed every 2 years in a different city. The last city he was in was Nablus, and I was born there. I have a sister born in Jerusalem, one born in Mashdal, which became Ashkelon later, and one was born in Hebron, and 2 of us were born in Nablus. So I represent all of Palestine. I have a Jerusalem ID because I married a Jerusalemite, and it was possible to get one. And of course, I'm a descendant of a Ramallah family. So we are, I'm Palestine as a whole, as I said. I've studied in Ramallah. That's where I spent most of my young adulthood, and then went to AUB, the American University of Beirut, and then University of Virginia.
Yes.
So I don't want to talk too much about my life.
No, but it's sometimes the personal narrative is so much interconnected to the political and how we view the Palestinian. Again, myself, my family is from Nablus. I have family in Nablus, family in Jerusalem, family in Ramallah, in Jordan, and then in US, in Germany. So Palestinians, in essence, his footprint is reflective of both the internal dynamics, but also the diaspora that we're all also experiencing.
Exactly. Well, I've witnessed both, actually. My parents were in Tiberias, and I was a baby when the war broke out in 48 during the Nakba. So they left Amman. And then from Amman, they came back to the West Bank, to Ramallah. But in the meantime, Tiberias was in Israel per se. And as you said, the Palestinian narrative is a collective of personal stories of either dispersion, uprootedness, dispossession, or a story of oppression, discrimination, and captivity. And all in all, I don't think a single Palestinian can escape any of these things. It's a type of all-encompassing injustice and oppression.
I interviewed a Palestinian refugee that became refugee 6 times.
6 times.
From 48 to 67, from 67 to Jordan. From Jordan, went to Lebanon after Black September. Lebanese civil war, went to Kuwait. The Iraqi invasion of Kuwait ended in the empty quarter, and then finally migrated to the United States.
Wow. Yeah.
So you're dealing with a six different epics, if you want to write the narrative of a Palestinian in that context.
Absolutely. And add to that the whole history of denial.
Sure.
Because right now, not only is our narrative being distorted, in many cases, they're trying to deny our very existence. And that type of negation or denial has also been a driving force behind many Palestinians feeling that even though we are uprooted and dispersed and exiled and in refugee camps and as the indigenous population in what became Israel in 48 Palestine, or as people under occupation in the West Bank, including Jerusalem and in Gaza, that we do have a common narrative, that we are part of the same thread, the same story, with different types and sometimes even multiple types of oppression and dispossession. So it makes for a narrative which the Palestinians are very possessive about: our culture, our history, our presence, our deep-rootedness, our connection to the land. Because there were some, I don't have a word for it, some idiots who said Palestinians are an invented people. And we keep hearing that now. It's one way of denying your validity, your identity. And
well, that's an immediate connection in here to the United States. That's impact of Sheldon Adelson's that
Oh, yeah.
contributed to the campaign of at the time, the Speaker of the US Congress, who was running for election, and basically his contribution contributed to this phrasing that is there. So here the relationship between the local US politics and Palestine is just the whole 20th century and into the 21st century.
Oh, yes, the US has been an active player.
Yeah, Newt Gingrich, again, his impact and his contribution is there as a result of election campaign, which maybe would be a good segue to have the conversation. You both were a participant as well as a witness to the unfolding 30-year plus history of the peace process. And, and you know, as a person that both was engaged as well as observant to it, where are we at looking back, and then to touch on the annexation as we move forward?
Yeah, well, there is no peace process, so to speak.
Yes.
And I have repeatedly described this as all process and no peace, no substance from the beginning. I mean, when we went to Madrid and then went to Washington where we met, we went with a vision, with a work plan, with a commitment, with confidence. We were the people under occupation, telling our occupiers we want to be free and telling the world this is who we are. So we felt it was a real turning point. Maybe we were naive. I call it the age of innocence, probably, the age of optimism. But we felt we're challenging now, using the instruments that are in our favor, not guns and weapons, but using international law, using the engagement of the international community, international humanitarian law, and of course, a whole network of supporters and so on, that this is where we will make a difference. This is where we can expose the occupation and end it, and begin to end it in order to get our freedom, our dignity, our right to self-determination, to live in peace and safety on our own land. Unfortunately, the imbalance in power, the power asymmetry, was incorporated in the so-called peace process. The Americans engaged in a way, not as an even-handed peace broker, but as a strategic ally of Israel. And as even the American peace team admitted, they were acting as the lawyers of Israel. And they cleared everything up with Israel, and they gave Israel all the rewards, advance payments, positive inducements, and they used pressure and blackmail on us and so on. And at that time, the PLO was in exile in Tunis, and we felt it was our duty to bring legitimacy and recognition to the PLO as our national address, as the symbol of our national unity and identity. So this is where we felt we came from a position of strength. We were willing to negotiate and to challenge the Israelis in order to get our rights, because this is how we felt we could do it. Unfortunately, there was another channel later on that worked, and that worked differently. Our approach was to deal with all the core issues at first, deal with the territorial dimension and the legal dimension and the human dimension, but never deal with the technical functional approach.
Yes.
Because the issue is not technical functional. We were offered under occupation in the 80s to run our lives. We were offered all the jobs of the
village councils and
under occupation, and we refused. We said we will not work for the occupation. We are not employees of the occupation or administrators. I remember telling the military governor, then Menachem Milson, I think, why don't you just leave, and we are perfectly capable of running our lives.
I remember at the time when the Oslo was signed, you said that the signing of Oslo, it came from someone that didn't know or live under occupation.
Yeah.
That was your assessment
the
at the time.
signing itself, yes. They didn't understand the magnitude of the settlements, number one. They didn't understand the mentality of the Israeli occupation. I wrote in the Madrid speech, if you read it, I addressed the Israeli people and I said, we know you. We've seen you at your best, we have seen you at your worst, because the occupier cannot hide from its victim.
True.
And we have this real knowledge. We know the underbelly of the occupation, so to speak. And we weren't intimidated. And we weren't seeking to please or to prove ourselves. We just wanted to serve the people. We felt we were emissaries of the Palestinians, trying to get our rights. Unfortunately, in the discussions for the DOP, it was exactly the opposite. Rather than dealing with the land and the people and the rights and the core issues like the borders and so on, and the removal of settlements, we said before anything should happen, settlement construction should not only stop, not freeze, stop, but you should begin the dismantlement of settlements. We said we need to have full control over our land register and our population register, because these are the attributes of sovereignty. This is how we can begin to deconstruct and dismantle the systems of power and control of the occupation. Instead, in the negotiations for the DOP, and there were secret negotiations done by two people who did not really understand, frankly, I don't attribute bad motives, did not understand the magnitude, did not understand the ramifications of the functional approach, did not understand that when you adopt a phased approach, and when you don't have any kind of arbitration, when you don't have any kind of intervention or engagement, when the Israelis do not respect any terms of reference that we had worked on before, based on international law, what you're doing is empowering the occupation and disempowering the people under occupation, the weaker party, rather than the other way around. We entered this trying to challenge and to put ourselves on the map. And the agreements had so many built-in flaws, including, all the things I talked about. I mean, how can you relinquish any control over Jerusalem and postpone it without any guarantees? How can you not discuss the dismantlement of settlements and postpone it without any guarantees? How can you accept, postponing the issue of borders? Had we agreed on borders, that's it then. Anyway, so the post-mortem is always interesting, but the thing is we wrote about this from the beginning. And we said we are facing an enemy, an occupier who's using the peace process and the special relationship with the US to entrench the occupation and to annex and expand. This is where annexation comes in. And use the politics of power and control in order to coerce the Palestinians into signing away their rights. And this is something that we couldn't condone at all. So after they signed, I attended the signature, I went to the White House. Faisal and I went there because we didn't want to show any division. Although I spoke out against the agreements, I refused to engage in negotiations after that. And I said very openly that anything from then on, is not something I would care to be part of. And anything that is framed by the Declaration of Principles, which people call the Oslo process because it has many agreements after that, is something I don't want to be part of. But at the same time, I was engaged on the ground, at home, building civil society institutions, working at one point, as you said, I agreed to be Minister of Higher Education and Research, because I felt this is how we could help empower the Palestinians, build the things that mean a lot to us, and that can, maintain our resilience on the ground. And I ran for every election that there was, because we needed representation and strong representation. As people say, I've always been a troublemaker, but it's important to call things.
So silence does not change history. You have to...
No, and you have to be honest with yourself and with others. And if you want other people's respect, you have to respect yourself first and respect them. So it was an ongoing struggle. And we saw how things unfolded since then. How Israel used its power, its really system of control, in order to maintain the subjugation of Palestinians, maintain the captivity, to reorganize the occupation. Look at what they did in Gaza. They keep saying we left Gaza. What do you mean we left Gaza? You just reinvented the occupation into a system of control, long distance, without any responsibility. So you can besiege Gaza, you can strangulate Gaza, you can turn Gaza into a huge open-air prison, and turn it into an unlivable situation and say, what's wrong with them? We left them. So it is a new type of military occupation, and yet they carry out incursions, they kill thousands of people, they bomb, they shoot, they shot and killed unarmed demonstrators, they had sniper fire and so on. So it's become, again, a symbol of the total disdain for human lives and for Palestinian rights and for the Palestinian narrative and needs, because the people in Gaza who were demonstrating could see their own land in Israel, because many of them were the refugees.
Yeah, 90% of Gaza's population are refugees from 48.
Refugees. And they were talking about the right of return. They were talking about their land that they could see beyond the border and they couldn't reach. And they were shot within Gaza, not even outside Gaza. And then to add, insult to injury, they were all labeled as terrorists. This is very convenient. The labeling of Palestinians, it's another form of dismissal and dehumanization. So the whole situation continued with devising different ways of control and expanding at the same time, enhancing Israel's impunity. It could act outside the law with full impunity, without any kind of curbs and without any kind of accountability. And this is what led to the sense of invincibility that the Israelis have, that they could do anything to the Palestinians and get away with it, because nobody could stop them beyond a few statements of censure, statements of denunciation, and a few slaps on the wrist, naughty, naughty. The international community was helpless. Not only that, but in many ways complicit with the Israeli occupation and its persistent violations and cruelty, a very pervasive system of cruelty and oppression in every aspect of our life. And that's where we are now. When Israel annexed Jerusalem right after the 67 war in 68, it took it over. In 1980, it legislated, as you know, the Jerusalem annexation bill law. And in 1981, it legislated for the annexation of the Golan Heights, the Syrian Golan Heights. What happened? We didn't see this uproar. We didn't see people talk about land theft, war crimes.
Sure.
And the thing is, Israel could literally get away with murder. And everybody was saying, so long as there's a peace process, God's in his heaven, all's well with the world. So long as they're talking to each other, it's fine.
Well, somebody defined that the peace process is creating the facts on the ground, and every new fact on the ground becomes the basis of a new set of negotiations or perceptions of negotiations to actually change the goal line to something different.
Yes, exactly. What Israel does, negotiations were very sporadic. And I said, no people have engaged in different types of negotiations as the Palestinians. We said direct and indirect and proxy negotiations and multilateral negotiations and bilateral negotiations and exploratory and epistolary and everything, every type of negotiation. The thing is, Israel, through negotiations, introduces its own wills and desires and so on, like the idea of swaps, for example. And then they turn it into a fact, and they pocket this concept as though it's a foregone conclusion, and they move. And from then, they want something else. It's the same thing when they talk about the settlement blocks. There is this myth now that, well, these settlement blocks are going to be part of Israel no matter what, in any agreement. Well, who told you so? Why? Just because you want it to be that way? Settlements are illegal, regardless if it's a settlement block or an outpost or an isolated settlement. They are not neighborhoods. They are illegal, there are war crimes, there is land theft, and there is Israeli expansion, and this is unacceptable. But at the same time, they somehow create facts, follow them up with repetitive myths and narratives, and then the world adopts the version that Israel tries to sell. And it becomes, with repetition, it gains a sort of traction of its own. And then people come to the Palestinians and say, why don't you be creative? Why don't you come up with new ideas? I said, how more creative can we be? I mean, this is international law. These are our lands, our rights. This is the right to self-determination that we want, the right to live in freedom and dignity on our own land. I mean, this sovereignty, these are rights that are recognized internationally. We agreed to negotiate, we agreed to be flexible, we agreed to recognize Israel. Now that's not enough. Because when Yasser Arafat and Rabin recognized each other, Rabin recognized the PLO as a legitimate representative. Arafat recognized Israel's right to exist within secure and recognized boundaries. So till now, the Israelis have never recognized our right to exist within secure and recognized boundaries on our land, our right to self-determination, our right to freedom and dignity. They never have, because all along there was this underlying theme, ongoing, translated politically on the ground, of expansion, annexation, and creating Greater Israel, superimposing, as I say, Greater Israel over all of historical Palestine.
And so maybe this is a good point. I've been observing, and you might correct me if that's wrong, that there's been a shift in language among the Palestinians, both inside and outside. So we're speaking about annexation, occupation, settlements. Increasingly, people are using colonialism. This is settler colonialism, apartheid. So how do you observe this change in language, and what does it point toward?
Well, actually, it's not a new language, it's a new emphasis.
Okay.
And I think if you read Ilan Pape, I'm sure you've read him. I think The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, I always quote him, his displacement replacement paradigm. This really encapsulates the whole reality. They want to displace and replace a whole nation, a whole people, not just in terms of the geography and demography, but in terms of the culture and the history, and even the naming of places, and then the creation of myths and stories and the negation of our history and culture and narrative. So this is happening. But now the narrative, it is a settler colonial enterprise, very clearly. And now even within Israel, and there were many people talking about this before, and the issue of apartheid has come up repeatedly because there is a crime of apartheid in international law, as you know, and it has to be accountable. People who engage in apartheid have to be held accountable. It's the responsibility of the international community to take steps to sanction people who engage in apartheid. So that multi-tiered approach to our reality. It is occupation, but occupation is misleading in some ways because people can assume it's temporary. And this is what Israel exploited all along, that if it's an occupation, then it's temporary. And this is what the liberal Zionists always believed. You know, the Zionist left always believed that it's an occupation, it's temporary, we will disengage, we will leave. Let's just see how we can disengage. In the meantime, Israel was not working according to the left-wing Zionist approach. It was working according to the ideological, absolutist approach of this is the land that God gave us, and we're going to take it all, creating facts systematically. But occupation also included expropriation, appropriation. It included land theft, theft of resources. It included, again, what we talk about, negation and denial. And it included setting up a system of apartheid over all of the West Bank. And we described it earlier as being the superimposing a grid of infrastructure on the West Bank and Jerusalem, taking away Jerusalem and so on, extracting it from its Palestinian environment, and at the same time linking the settlements to Israel in a blatant exercise of extraterritoriality while controlling any kind of movement and controlling the natural resources in the West Bank through settlements and others, and building apartheid roads. They would confiscate the land to build roads for Jews only, but not for Palestinians. And the Israelis had their own laws. They were not subject to our laws, but they're the only people on earth who are living on other people's lands, but carry their own laws with them. This is apartheid. There were roads that were only for the Israelis. There were lands that belonged to the Palestinians, whether collectively or individual property, that were stolen and being built on. So the occupation has many aspects. And it generated this, and it allowed Israel to use its control and power to create an apartheid system and to create this sense of entitlement, of exceptionalism, while systematically trying to negate and dehumanize the Palestinians. Systematically. We were the invisible victims for a long time. The world didn't want to know. And they invented ways of silencing us. Still now, sometimes I get tweets saying, well, stop complaining, stop, showing your grievances. They're not complaints, they're not showing grievances. This is the tip of the iceberg of what Israel does, and it is our job to make this known to the rest of the world and to challenge the ignorance and the lack of conscience of many.
The invisibility and erasure. Just on Wednesday, I received a new book, and I looked usually to see. And the one part is speaking about 1920 Akka and Haifa. And it says, Akka, Israel, Haifa, Israel. Well, Israel did not exist in 1920. So
exactly.
even if you wanted to make a claim that is contrary to the factual historical record, Israel did not come into existence until May 15th, 1948.
Yeah,
so now
this is a battle. Yeah, my sister she was born in Jerusalem, and the Americans kept telling her Jerusalem, Israel, and she kept saying, no, it was Jerusalem, Palestine. And I was born in Palestine, not in Israel. And there was no Israel when I was born. She's my oldest sister. And it was a long, long battle. Finally, the Americans said, okay, Jerusalem. They didn't say Palestine or Israel, but for a long time they wanted to say Israel. So how can you claim that you existed when, and they claim that we didn't exist when there are all sorts of proofs, of evidence. I said, look at the money, the passports, it's not just that. Yeah, it's the issue of attempting to displace and replace the whole people. Look at the names. I keep saying they steal our names. This is very important because when they build a settlement next to a village, they steal the name of the village and give the settlement a Hebrew name equivalent to the Arabic name. So they're competing over existence as though the settlement existed before the village or is part of the same naming process. This is one thing that really hurts. Look at the streets in the city of Jerusalem, how they change the names of the streets and so on. And it's systematic. It's a structural, systemic approach to the erasure of a nation and evidence of its history and so on. But of course, they don't control all the evidence. They may have, hidden the archives. They may have kept secret all the different documents about the massacres and about all the books that were stolen. Remember the big scandal?
Well, the archive of the historian Muhammad Nimr in Nablus, they took all of his archive and all of his library and confiscated. So for those who are watching that work on the academic boycott level, what we have is the circumstance where Palestinian academic, intellectual, literary heritage is literally stolen almost on a daily basis. And we can see about the archives also in Lebanon during the invasion of Lebanon.
The invasion of Lebanon, exactly. All the documents and the historical records and so on. But this is what they did in 48.
Yes.
And there was a big scandal about the discovery that the army has hidden all these, and although they had cataloged all the volumes and volumes, thousands of libraries and books and so on that were stolen and confiscated, they hid them. But the new historians who used the
Israeli
intelligence archives used the Israeli military archives, or whatever was available to them. And this is how they managed to get through the real narrative of 48 and of the massacres and of the expulsion and so on, in order to counter the myths that the Palestinians left, or there were no Palestinians, or the Arabs told them to leave and so on. So that the Israeli historians had access to the truth, and they did. Now, unfortunately, somebody like Benny Morris and so on says there was ethnic cleansing. It's unfortunate that we didn't finish it. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a problem with the Palestinians.
Yeah, he visited Berkeley, and he was saying to make an omelet, you have to crack eggs. So basically, his framing is that we needed to create the Zionist omelet, and in order to get that, you crack the Palestinian eggs.
Exactly, and he regretted that they didn't succeed
yes,
in ethnically cleansing all of Palestine, because now they have a problem with the Palestinians. Had they succeeded in getting rid of all of us, then they wouldn't have this problem.
Yeah, I think the work of Avish Laim,
now you have, yes,
Ilan Pape, even our late colleague Ibrahim Abu Lughod, where he documented that history. So there's a wealth of material, and I'll make sure to put that for people who are watching on Facebook, because it's important to read, to have access really to the history.
Exactly. So there is sufficient evidence, not just from Palestinians and Israelis, but even globally. Look at the Ottoman archives, look at the British archives, and so on. So all the fake, the alternative narratives that they're creating about Palestinians are exposed, I mean, for what they are. This Hasbara, this real cheap propaganda, if I may say so.
Yeah, if I may plug in the work of Professor Bisharat Doumani at Brown University, who does a lot of the work on archives, on family archives, on the Sharia oral history with Dr. Tamimi as well. So there's really a rich
brilliant, yes,
some
exactly.
brilliant work that is taking place, and
there's some literature that's coming out too.
Absolutely. I'm more of the political side, but I know that you are on the literature side.
No, but I read the politics and I read the literature. I read the literature, because now we're seeing some powerful voices. I'm influenced because I just read Susie's book, Susan Abul Hawa's book.
Oh, Susan Abul Hawa, yes.
Yeah, her latest book has just been released, and it's remarkable. I suggest that you read it, because it encompasses also several aspects of the Palestinian experience, not just in Palestine, but in exile. And I don't call them diaspora. I think the Palestinians are either in exile, or they are refugees and people in exile, or if they want to be expats, those who left of their own will. But in most cases, it's refugees and exiles.
Yeah. Now, maybe, can you read to us, what are the Israeli leadership thinking? And again, I'm giving them what you call a little bit of benefits. What are they thinking? What is the strategy that they're unfolding right now? Are they seeing there is a weakness in the US, or they have their favorite person in the White House, in the State Department, in the embassy, and therefore trying to get basically the end product or end deal of Greater Israel? Is that the thinking?
Well, the Israeli thinking right now among official circles is that they have managed, Netanyahu as the longest governing prime minister in Israel, has, along with his several coalitions, managed to shift the whole discourse and the whole political platform within Israel to the extreme right. The whole political terrain has moved to the right, to the extreme right, forming alliances also with the fundamentalists and with the religious people, to the point where the language now, as I said, is biblical language. The language is the language of absolutism and divine right and dogma and so on, that God chose us with. I mean, it's incredible. Even the guy in Danny Danon at the UN said, we don't need national law, we have the Bible, this is ridiculous. I mean, I don't know. So add
But
to that.
it actually sells to the US evangelical right, which
Exactly.
is at the hub of their support in the United States.
Yeah, it's the base
Yes.
of Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Sheldon Adelson funds Trump. I mean, people were talking about Adelson as somebody who wanted to buy a prime minister in Israel and a president in the US, and he managed to do both.
Mm-hmm.
But he does affect policy. I mean, he's to the right of AIPAC even, and to the right of most people in Israel, to the right of the Israeli politicians. And of course, the evangelicals have their own literal readings of the Bible, which are extremely dangerous. But the difference is that now they have power. Now, when you have Pence as vice president, when you have Pompeo waiting for the rapture as Secretary of State, and add to that, you have fundamentalist Christians, you have fundamentalist Zionists, you have Friedman, David Friedman, who's the so-called ambassador, American ambassador to Israel, who is trying to change the whole language and approach. He's pushing the Israelis to annex.
Mm-hmm.
And he's pushing the American, he's the one who removed the term occupation openly and who said that settlements are not illegal, these are not settlements, these are Jewish neighborhoods. And how dare you think you can remove any Jew from his ancestral homeland and so on. So his is the real extremist, fundamentalist language of ideology that has nothing to do with legality or politics or peace in any way, shape, or form. And he's really inciting for greater expansion and so on. And he used to have Jason Greenblatt and Jared Kushner,
Mm-hmm.
who formed, a whole collective for the so-called peace process. And the peace plan or the deal of the century or the ultimate deal or whatever you want. It's extremely dangerous because it destroys not only the chances of peace, but it creates underground real instability.
Mm-hmm.
And it sends a clear message that there is no international law, there is no accountability. You can act outside the law, you can act fully with impunity, and you get rewarded for it, provided you have the support of the US. Now, the US has never been an even-handed peace broker. Mm-hmm. It was always supportive of Israel.
The work of Nasir Aruri, dishonest broker, comes to mind.
Yeah. And we said that, and I was in charge of negotiating with the Americans during the Washington process. Mm-hmm. And I've always told them that. And I even diagnosed all the different ways in which they coordinated with the Israelis first. They cleared up any American position with the Israelis. That they always tried to put pressure on the Palestinians and get rewards for Israel and so on, like nullifying, negating the Zionism is racism resolution mm-hmm. at the UN and so on. And opening doors and opportunities for Israel within the region. Now this has been taken to the extreme. Now the American administration under Trump is trying very hard to normalize Israel within the region, put the Arab Peace Initiative on its head, so to speak, to transform the Palestinian issue into a domestic Israeli issue, giving Israel full control over it. And at the same time, they took unilateral, illegal steps on the ground, so they became partners in crime. That's why we call them part of the occupation, not a solution to the occupation. The moment they recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, that's it. And they moved their embassy there. Then they closed down the consulate, which was, the American consulate was built in 1844 in Jerusalem as the diplomatic mission to Palestine.
Yeah, and I remember the Ottoman documents that allowed them to set up the consulate.
Yes, because it was also later on based on corpus separatum, but this was a consulate to Palestine, not to Israel, that didn't exist. Mm-hmm. That's why they closed it. They're changing history, not just trying to change the future. And then, of course, they closed down our mission in Washington, but they also stopped any kind of support for the Palestinians, any kind of cooperation agreements were totally canceled.
And the cutting of funding for UNRWA as well through the United Nations.
Targeting UNRWA is very insidious because they have been trying to redefine a refugee. Who's a refugee? Mm-hmm. And they're trying to say that refugees are those who left in 48 only. So they are attempting to compete with international law and the definition of refugee by adopting the Israeli extreme definition of Palestinian refugees as those who left in 48. That's it. And how many are left? 20,000 are alive or something? That's what we have. 20 to 40,000 refugees, not 5.5 to 6 million refugees. So that's the issue. By targeting UNRWA, they're targeting the whole refugee issue in itself. And they are targeting the most vulnerable population among the Palestinians, the refugees. And UNRWA is an international organization. It wasn't set up by the US. It wasn't set up by the Palestinians. It's an international organization entrusted with caring for the refugees. I don't want to go into all of that, but still. So they're looking at every component of Palestinian life, as well as the so-called core issues for negotiations, and attempting to predetermine the outcome unilaterally, single-handedly. So this administration has emboldened Israel. It has given it not just support and cover, but it has given it full partnership, and it has taken upon itself these illegal steps. And moving on, from there. But now the Israeli political scene is very complex because clearly, like Trump, Netanyahu is facing serious problems. I mean, both of them acted on the basis of what's good for them individually. They took policy decisions individually. They wanted to get re-elected so they could do whatever they want. But Netanyahu wanted to stay out of jail. And now the evidentiary trials will start in January. That's why he's trying to find ways of having elections, because he entered into a coalition with blue and white. Now, and entering into a coalition with blue and white has dealt a serious blow to the Israeli political scene, frankly speaking. Blue and white betrayed their allies. They even betrayed the Arab Joint List that, believed them that anybody but Netanyahu is their mantra. So they went to bed with Netanyahu. They, in many ways, dismantled, deconstructed the opposition, because not all of blue and white wanted to enter into this coalition. They also betrayed Meretz and everybody else. So there is no opposition in Israel now worth anything. So if Netanyahu wants elections, he probably can win. But at the same time, he is facing a trial on 3 corruption charges. He's also facing lots of protests against his own handling of the corona crisis, because it's now, not just a spike or a surge, it's gone beyond control. And he's facing lots of criticism concerning the economy. So all these things are together. Now, he used to think that Trump is his savior, because at every phase, Trump would step in to try to help Netanyahu win elections, to try to help Netanyahu get more funding. But now it's clear that both of these people are in trouble. And now it's clear that this dysfunctional system in Israel is probably coming to another crisis. It's unable to function. And at the same time, the so-called annexation cannot be, although I think he used it as a diversionary tactic, because he's been annexing all along. But then he said, look, I'm going to annex. So everybody said he's threatening to annex. Let's stop him. Let's do it. But he's been annexing. So in a sense, what he's done is he's tried everything. And now he used to say he will make use of the fact that Trump is in office. This is what David Friedman says, so that they can annex quickly, so they can create facts, because now there is clear fear that Trump will not win or might not win the next election in November. So this mad rush to create facts. Now within the US, as you know, there are 2 different points of view, whether he should annex now or he should annex later, and how much should he annex. But in the meantime, this isn't going to make a difference, because I believe, as in the States, the evangelicals are not going to look at Trump and vote for him on the basis of whether they annex or not, but on the basis of their own self-interest too. The economy is bad. The Corona
Well,
crisis.
maybe this also raises another issue that we confront in the United States, that many of the Zionist pro-Israel spokespeople, they try to stoke the Muslim-Christian relations in Palestine and posit that Israel and the evangelical rights are there to protect the Palestinian Christians. And I know this is just a complete false premise. I know from my relationship and work with Father Atiq and the Kairos Palestina document. But in general, there is this constant propaganda that is really rallying the base on those issues.
No, it's not just the base, Hatem.
Yeah.
I think in many ways Israel and probably the US would like to turn this into a Jewish Muslim confrontation, a religious conflict, rather than a human, moral, legal situation where Israel is an occupying power and is committing war crimes and so on. So once you turn it into a confrontation between Judaism and Islam, of course they can call on what they call the Judeo-Christian tradition and so on, and they can stoke Islamophobia and use it. This comes not just out of ignorance. In Israel, it comes out of a manipulative political point of view. In the States, they might be willing to swallow this out of ignorance because they don't know the reality of life in Palestine. Look, historically, Palestine has always been the land of tolerance, of pluralism, the land where, I mean, there has never been any discrimination. We were Muslims, Christians, Jews, and I mean, there is room also for non-believers and Buddhists and whatever you want. But this is the land where you have the freedom to exercise your faith or lack thereof at every point. I mean, when I was growing up as a child, we didn't know who was a Christian, who was a Muslim. We generally, all of us wanted to fast Ramadan, and all my classmates had Christmas trees. So it didn't make a difference. To us, the identity of being Palestinian and the sort of human community that we had, and we still have, was paramount. And so the attempt to manipulate religion so cynically has been used, and it has been played also by racists, xenophobes, Islamophobes, anti-Semites even, because the moment you enter that domain, which has become very popular with Trump and with Netanyahu and with Bolsonaro and with Orban and with everybody else, you start with populism, and then you start with racism and xenophobia and Islamophobia, and the white supremacists themselves, who are anti-Semitic as well as
yes.
So it plays into the hands of those extremists. It plays into the hands of those who use convenient and misleading labels in order to misrepresent the Palestinians. It is part of the whole myth of either non-existent or all terrorists or all, what do they call it, Muslim extremists and so on. And they don't recognize the reality of Palestine, and they don't recognize the fact that Israel now is preventing Palestinians, whether Christians or Muslims, from reaching their holy sites in Jerusalem, for example, or Bethlehem. That the Palestinians of Gaza cannot come to the West Bank, that people in Ramallah and Nablus and Hebron and so on cannot go to Jerusalem, and that Jerusalem is surrounded by checkpoints, by a horrific apartheid wall, by settlements, rings of settlements and so on to isolate it. And people cannot go and pray. People cannot reach Al-Aqsa or the Church of the Holy Sepulchre or whatever. And if you want to go, you need a permit, and permits are next to impossible to get. So this is religious freedoms, and they target freedom under Islam. They target different groups, and they try to isolate and separate the way they did with the indigenous Palestinians of 48. And they said, okay, you are Druze, and you are Christians, and you are Muslims, and so on. So they created a hierarchy of discrimination. Until now, it is functioning
Well,
the same.
settler colonialism always works around demographic designs and structures of racial demarcation.
Yes, absolutely. And religious demarcation.
Religious demarcation as well.
Very, very clearly, and trying to differentiate their treatment in an institutional and legal way, because they also pass bills and laws that give certain groups more privileges than others. And even that within the Jewish society as a whole. As you know, look at the way in which immigrants from Ethiopia, where women were given birth control against without knowing it, or where the blood that the Black Jews donated was thrown away because.
Or the case of Yemeni kids taken from their families so as to be acculturation, which
yes, had anybody else done that anywhere in the world, all hell would break out. Everybody would say this is unconscionable, but because Israel did it. I mean, okay, so they move ahead. But there is a very intricate system of structural, institutional, and legal discrimination that is so complex, but that affects everybody within Israel, Jewish Israelis as well as non-Jewish Israelis. Yeah. And it's really very serious. But the worst is that they feel they have the right to do anything to the Palestinians and get away with it. No accountability. They can demolish your home. They don't need to prove it. They can arrest you with no evidence. And then they can label you as a terrorist. And then they have the slogan, pay to slay. They've arrested more than 800,000 Palestinians, between 800,000 to 1 million Palestinians since 1967. Are we all terrorists? They've killed 75,000 Palestinians since 1967, or more, close to 80 now, thousand. Have they all been engaged in terrorist activities? The only terrorism we see right now comes from the settlers and comes from the army that shoots to kill. The extrajudicial executions, the settlers who are attacking, especially isolated villages, they're on the rampage every day. That's why I said sometimes I cannot just encompass all the injustice. We don't have time or the ability to keep up.
Yeah, well, something that I want to raise that people are unaware of is the whole attack on Palestinian agriculture sector, the burning of trees, the cutting of trees, really targeting environmentally, and in here a critique to the environmental movement, both in the United States and in the West. It's almost silence, and on the opposite, promotion of coming and planting a tree in Israel. So you have this contradiction in there. And I think there was one story where some of the trees that were uprooted from the West Bank were actually sold in Tel Aviv.
Yeah, so they were taken and they're planted in Israel per se, and on the road from Tel Aviv to the West Bank. They uproot very ancient olive trees and then they replant them or resell them. But what's more painful is how the settlers, with the protection of the army, can burn olive trees, can uproot trees, can come and really saw down and destroy trees, and can intimidate and terrorize people who are collecting their harvest, their olive harvest and so on, and getting away with it. Because to the Palestinians, the olive tree is a way of life. We identify with the olive tree. To us, the olive tree is life. It's the landscape, it's the land, it's the organic relationship with the land. It is also the economy, because the olives keep people alive. I mean, the olive harvest, the olive oil, the zeytu za'atar.
It's intertwined also with theology as well, in terms of what you think about, the narrative of Jesus, peace be upon him, and the intertwining of the olive branch in there.
Exactly. That is something that's unique about the olive tree in Palestine, and this identification that is a totality of it. And they target olive trees. They've been doing this because this way they destroy the livelihoods of people. They change the nature of the terrain. They change the continuity with the land. And they give the settlers so much power over people's lives. It's happening daily now. It's happening daily where they do that. They also threaten the shepherds, for example, and take their sheep or whatever. They do all sorts of things now. And not just now, they have been, but now it's escalating, it's intensive. And they're getting away with it because they feel that this is one way of creating an atmosphere of terror and fear, and where they can start to dislodge Palestinians from their land. You affect their lives, their livelihood, their lands, and so on. In areas in the northwest villages of Jerusalem, the settlements pour their sewer system all the way into the villages, and the water sources, spring, yeah. And that's okay. They have no respect for the environment. But you can come and plant a tree in Israel and say you've done something good for Israel, you know, while they are uprooting our trees. You can talk about the environment and so on, while Israel has been systematically degrading the environment as a whole. Actually, they use lots of Palestinian land as dumping ground for some of the products of their industry and so on.
Yeah, well, that's again the challenge. What you have is this neoliberal environmental movement that erases Palestine and Palestinians and engages Israel, Zionism, as the almost the go-to experts on how to preserve the environment, how to,
Really?
yes, it's how to treat water, how to minimize the use of water, because they had the development of the skills in the kibbutz and Israel innovation, while simultaneously a total erasure of the structural degradation of Palestinian environment going on almost for 70 years.
Yeah, I think they should come and see what they're doing to the environment in the West Bank and Gaza. I mean, people know that Gaza is not going to be habitable for long. There is no potable water anyway. It's been entirely polluted, and yet they are closed in and they have no access. The same thing with their plants, with their water treatment plants and waste treatment plants and so on. So it's very clear that Israel can create a system in which it claims that like the only democracy and so on, and yet it can hold a whole nation captive, steal our resources, degrade our environment, steal our water. Frankly, I mean, what kind of water resources do they have? What they're doing is basically depriving the Palestinians of our own water and giving the settlers all the water that they need to water their lawns and have swimming pools and so on. And this is how they manage water, because all you need to do is steal other people's waters. So I think if this is an example they want to set to the rest of the world, occupy another people's land, confiscate their resources and the water and so on, degrade their environment, but keep yours. And then claim, one thing that really is horrible, is they claim that the weapons that they sell are tried and tested.
Yeah.
That their security systems are tried and tested. That their intelligence systems are tried and tested. They have a captive Palestinian population, especially in Gaza, where they try their weapons and they test them against a captive civilian population. And then in the West Bank, of course, they have all these checkpoints and intelligence systems and different weapons shoot to kill policy. And then the world says, isn't it amazing the startup nation has done so much? Yeah, if you have a captive population for experimentation and to try and test your weapons and intelligence systems, then of course you're going to become advanced and you sell them. And those who buy them don't understand the major price that is being, or they do, but they don't want to internalize this knowledge.
And I have two sets of questions that many people have asked, and I'll ask them. But as you shifted to the training and the military and so on, that our local police departments in the United States, at least we knew from the Ferguson, but even before, actually send their officers to be trained in Israel on the know-how. So the knee on George Floyd's neck in Minneapolis has direct connection to the training and making Israel the go-to expert on policing, on surveillance, on all these structures that have been tested on the Palestinians, including the use of the surveillance structure in Boston Airport, which was actually directly connected to the structure of surveillance that was set up in Jerusalem. So talk about these connections that are immediately there.
Exactly. Look, any oppressive system makes use of the experiences of other oppressive systems, but I never thought that the US police would treat their own citizens, Americans, as though they are under occupation. Now, Israel as an occupying power has, no holds barred. They do whatever they want because they think they're entitled. Nobody will hold them accountable. There is no law that applies. But to treat your own people as though you're their occupier, to bring in the army and to train your police that's supposed to serve as law enforcement to protect the lives and property of the people and so on, to maintain law and order, yes, but also to maintain the law, rule of law. To treat your own people that way and to send the police to train in Israel and to use the tactics of the occupier, to me, this is unconscionable. But of course, we all knew that.
Well, the US has a long, complex history. It's a settler colonial society itself. So there are lines of entanglements, but increasingly this is a feature where Israel proactively actually recruits with some of the major Zionist organizations in the United States, the ADL, the AJC, promote these programs. Here in San Francisco Bay Area, we had what's called Urban Shield, where Israeli Shin Bet comes and actually help train police in so-called counterterrorism. So you have a lot of these lines of entanglements.
Yeah, absolutely. And the whole system of discrimination and the multi-tiered level of this. Look, the denial of the rights and the narrative of the indigenous, of the native peoples, nations. What happened in the States, in Canada, and Australia, and so on. And then add to that the discrimination against the Black population that has been ongoing, again, systematically, and they've been silenced the way the Palestinians have been silenced. Now they're trying to break the link between the treatment of Palestinians and the treatment of Blacks, because it's feel that since there is the Black Lives Matter movement has been so identified with Palestine, the Palestinians identify so much with the Black Lives Matter, and it has been ongoing for a
long period of time. Angela Davis actually mentioned that when she was arrested in the 1960s, that she received a letter of solidarity from the Palestinian prisoners.
And I remember how solidarity, even from people, from students and the student movement and so on, was very strong with Angela Davis and the others. But the question is now, there are voices in Israel that are trying to raise two things. Use the anti-Semitism label, especially with the Black solidarity with Palestine, by saying if you criticize Israel, then you are anti-Semitic. And now there are rising voices saying, look, the Blacks are being anti-Semitic. This is extremely dangerous. And they're trying to find examples to silence the movement and the progressive movement in the US, that they're being anti-Semitic because they criticize Israel. This conflation of as you know, of criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism has been used effectively in many cases to silence any kind of solidarity or support for Palestine, and also to intimidate. Look, they've intimidated whole governments in Europe, really. And in the same way as they criminalize BDS, that you cannot use your right to be an ethical consumer, you cannot use your right to be an ethical investor, for example, you cannot use your voice to speak for the silenced and so on, because that would be criminal or anti-Semitic. It's incredible how they've done that. And at the same time, how some people in the US have picked it up and have even passed laws criminalizing BDS or adopting the extreme right-wing definition of criticism of Israel as being anti-Semitism. And I'm very glad that in the States you have some very vocal and powerful Jewish voices and organizations who are standing up and defying these, and who are exposing this cheap attempt at silencing people and at even accusing them of being anti-Semitic and silencing dissident Jewish voices. So we're seeing a change. We're seeing a new language. We're seeing a refusal to be intimidated. Before, it used to be easier because anybody who criticized Israel would lose his or her job, would lose elections next time, would feel AIPAC would, threaten them, or they would not just stop funding, but they would fund the opposition and so on.
They're still attempting to that. For example, they're funding opposition to Rashida Tlaib in Michigan, trying to rally around opposition to Ilhan Omar. So AIPAC is still playing its game, but now you actually have some people that are moving in opposition.
Beyond that, yes.
Beyond that.
Look, when Elliot Engel lost to Jamal Bowman, this was a clear message that even if you have AIPAC money and even GOP money, and you interfere in elections domestically, that there are people who will act on the basis of their own conscience and convictions. And it's not enough now for AIPAC to endorse somebody to win. This is a very important lesson to be heard. Now they're trying to mobilize, yes, I know, but it's important also that the progressives and the minorities and the academics and people who know better stand up and speak out. I think Bernie Sanders in many ways did us a favor because he really broke taboos. And he mentioned the unmentionable. And he talked about the Palestinians as equals, which before was not done. You cannot talk about Palestinians as equals or having equal rights. Otherwise, you're anti-Semitic. So in this case, I think that there is a change. And we hope that there will be people who listen and who will understand what's happening and not be intimidated again when it comes to what is right.
Maybe I want to try to conclude with the Palestinian political scene. It's very clear that the division that is there is to our detriment. It empowers the Arab world to basically speak without us or rush to normalization. And also our political infrastructure really need to be re-examined. So really, one is to end the division, the reimagining and rethinking our political agenda. Where the Palestinian struggle is there, that includes both the ones inside, the ones in exile, the refugees. Really just an open thinking of how to address that issue, and then how to give hope to people who are beginning to lose a sense of hope in the mix of looking at the avalanche or big mountains over their head.
Absolutely.
It's a difficult question, but again,
people do get overwhelmed, and I get overwhelmed.
No, absolutely.
Because wherever we go, whatever we do, you're always faced with one blow after the other, and it's very, very serious. But I think every time I talked at Berkeley or other places, I would say we are facing a confluence of adverse conditions and realities. We're seeing a convergence of all sorts of negative factors affecting our lives. We are seeing the Arab world in total disarray. We are seeing internal dysfunctional states. We are seeing not just civil wars, I call them proxy wars. And you have so many countries involved. You have outside countries, you have countries that are falling apart. Iraq has not recovered yet. You have Yemen, you have Syria, you have Libya. And there is, of course, an attempt at reorganizing the region and redefining who's a friend and who's a foe, who's an enemy, who's an ally. They're trying to create a simplistic polarization that Israel is a friend of the moderate Arab Sunnis and Iran is the real enemy of everybody else, and so on. And Israel has to be repositioned within the region to be not just an ally, but to be a leader in terms of its military and political and security and intelligence and economic power within the region. So this is why they're trying to put the Arab Peace Initiative on its head, normalize with the Arabs, reposition Israel, give it the power, and exclude the Palestinians. The same thing, the Europeans are having their own problems as well, and the issue of anti-Semitism and so on, but also now with the coronavirus, everybody is in this area. The economies all over the world are collapsing. The rise of even greater, not just populism, but the greater systems of authoritarianism and control as a result of the methods used during right now as we're going through the coronavirus pandemic. So it's not just the Arab world, it's not just the European world, it's not just the US. Globally, we are facing real problems. In Palestine, we've had this rift since 2007. It's a debilitating, serious, dangerous rift. People don't want it. People are really pushing for reconciliation. But this is not just a purely domestic Palestinian issue. There are others involved in this rift. There are others who are trying to maintain this rift, starting with Israel and push through some Arab countries and some regional non-Arab countries. This is very convenient for people to maintain the weakness, the division of the Palestinians, and therefore the weakness of the cause. And it has been a very convenient excuse for people to say, well, you're not unified, how can we talk to you? You're not unified, how can we help you? So the division started in 2007. Why didn't you liberate us before that? For example, if all our problems are due to the division. On the other hand, I do think that there are distortions within our own political system. There are built-in weaknesses, structural and legal and political and so on. There is a generational problem. There is a gender problem. All these things are part of an overall system that is in itself under siege, without much power, but at the same time, not exercising good governance the way it should. With external interventions. The push for reconciliation has been really strong by everybody, by the public as a whole and so on. And lately there have been talks, as you've heard, with the press conference that the Jibril had and so on. Hamas and Fatah are talking. They're now trying to coordinate. Now that there is no security coordination, now that the decisions of the PNC and the PCC, the Central Council, to sever all ties with Israel, including security coordination and so on, and any kind of coordination for that matter. However, the situation has become really critical because this all came to a head in the times of the coronavirus, in the time of the bankruptcy of the political system. And of course, when you have the responsibility of maintaining people's resilience and ability to stay on the land without being able to provide them with the necessary tools for resilience and maintaining the steadfastness, as we used to say. So all these matters, look, since the beginning of this year, not a single Arab country has in any way helped economically, knowing that Israel is withholding our taxes, our customs money, and so on. And knowing that the Palestinian system cannot last. We have hundreds of thousands of people who have no income in addition to the hardships of the coronavirus and the closure and so on. So it's a very critical situation. But at the same time, I think it has awakened people that it is time to get over your petty grievances. That this issue of competing for power and privilege and benefit and so on is ridiculous given the enormity of the challenges that we face. And it's a national challenge. It's not going to spare Hamas, it's not going to spare Fatah, and it's not going to spare any of the other factions. But there is also, as I said, a generational and a gender dimension. We have the young generation that has seen the older generation maintain and hog power time after time. And we need elections. We need to get the young, and they need to organize. I work with many men.
the issue of elections with only inside the occupied Palestine, and how to include people from outside, because that's been a challenge of how to make the continuities.
Of course you can. I mean, look, we live in an age of technology, information technology, and we're talking over Zoom. There is no way, there's no reason why you cannot, in many ways, have the Palestinians in exile and the refugee camps and expats participate to elect their own representatives. It used to be done, let's say, through having gatherings, different communities elect their own representatives. As you know,
I remember the last one we had. I remember being in San Francisco in '87, where we actually had in the elections at the local level.
Exactly.
We could have complaints about it, but still there was an engagement.
It's important. Yeah. And you have it in the States all along. You send people from Ramallah, you send people from Khalil, they have their own organizations and they elect their representatives, and you have your own civil society organizations that send their representatives. This is important, and we can do it globally, but you can also have electronic voting, hopefully, once you have an electoral register of voters. And it's easy to know who's a Palestinian. We don't have that problem because we all have different passports, we live in different places, but we know who's a Palestinian. So that can be done, that can be organized if we have the will and the means to do it. There are ways of doing it. The thing is, we need to be able also to have organization on the ground.
Mm-hmm. True.
Look what happened in Egypt. I mean, it's easy to bring down systems. But if you do bring down a system of government and a leadership that is not respected or wanted, you have to be in a position to take over. You cannot just have a revolution and then not organize on the ground. You can organize in cyberspace, you mobilize. But on the ground, if you don't organize, if you don't have the political systems and structures set up, if you do not enter into elections, you cannot replace what you don't want. So my work with the younger generation, and I keep trying to provoke and to get them to challenge and to organize, and they are just amazing young men and women. And I work with many young women who are incredible.
No, I could see that in the United States. I work with so many young people, Students for Justice in Palestine, Arab Student Union, MSAs, and they really are taking the struggle for Palestine and assertiveness to a new level. American Muslims for Palestine. So there is a new energy, and what we're missing is that bridge of institutional capacity building and in transforming our isolated work or possibly works in pockets into an effective structure. So I've been actually, how can we get that? And is there the leadership, Palestinian leadership on the ground is thinking in those ways to really bring...
Look, leadership within civil society, yes. Leadership that are not part of the system, yes. They keep saying, I challenge them. I'm an independent, so I'm free, I can speak my mind. I challenge everybody. Where is the younger generation? Where are the women? Every time we had an election for the PLO executive, they end up re-electing themselves or reappointing themselves. No, you need to make room for the young. On the one hand, you need to understand that within your own party political systems, if you do not include the young, if you do not make room, if you hog power and position, that they're going to have to remove you, or they're going to have to form alternative, other organizations that will be able to run against them. But right now, the whole system has been set in place for so long that we are losing the sense of energy, the sense of vision, the willingness to take risks, the young who can engage and change. And that's why I keep saying you need to challenge, you need to organize, you need to challenge, and you need to bring a vision and a work plan, and you have to organize. You cannot just define what you don't want. You have to come up with your own agenda, your own political program, and define what you want with a work plan, and you challenge. And I think you will find lots of people my age who will support them, who are trying very hard to make room, because left to its own devices, the system is not going to change. You have to challenge it from outside. And to stay outside and just criticize without real instruments of empowerment and, as you said, institutional, structural organization, you're not going to get anywhere. So these two are needed by both sides. I don't think it's both sides. I think we have now a greater realization that the same old mentality, the same old approach is not working. And the slogans are no substitute for real policy decisions. And engaging the world means you have to have your own confidence and vision and energy and spirit that cannot be defeated. And I think just saying, let's go back to negotiations is going back to what was before that did not work anyway. So now you need to go forward and not repeat the mistakes of the past.
Let me get to the last question, which many individuals have sent, because we asked people to submit questions about the one-state solution that is increasingly people are talking about.
Yeah.
So how does that sound? What are some of the thinking in Palestine about one-state solution? And I know it's a very complex piece, but what is your response to it?
It is complex. It's extremely complex.
Yes.
Look, it's not a new idea. When people tell me we are for rights and freedom and we don't want to talk about self-determination and sovereignty and so on, I say, why? It's our right to self-determination. Why do you abandon it? Huh? But it's the Palestinians. And I remember when I was in the General Union of Palestine Students in 1968, we came up with the one-state solution. Remember? The one democratic, non-sectarian or secular state where everybody can live in equality and peace and so on. So this was the preference of the Palestinians from the beginning. But the thing is now, after all these years, to come up and say, now we're going to have a one state without having a political plan, without understanding the implications of what that means. I think, frankly, I'll get to the conclusion, then I'll get back to it. I don't think either solution is available. I don't think it's either two states or one state, really. I think Israel has effectively on the ground destroyed the two-state solution. And unless you have a serious sea change among the international community to hold Israel accountable, to begin dismantlement of settlements, not just withdrawal, but you have to dismantle the settlements. You have to return the land to its rightful owners. You have to take serious steps that indicate political will and courage to stand up to Israel. You're not going to salvage a two-state solution. And Israel has been working systematically to ensure that there is no Palestinian state, that there is only one Palestinian state. And it has become, there's one Israeli state, and it has become an apartheid state, clearly, but not just apartheid, because as our friends in South Africa will tell you, it's worse than apartheid, because this is an attempt at the eradication of a whole presence. And I think there are people who are talking about the transfer, the silent transfer, the expulsion, and so on. They want the people without the land. So it could go to extremes, and it's very, very serious. Now, to move from there and say, okay, then the solution is one state, you need to be able to define it as a political program, define it as takers. You have to have your counterparts. You have to be able to mobilize and galvanize around it. You need, in a sense, to de-Zionize Israel. How do we get from there to the one state? By maintaining the occupation? By telling the Palestinians you have to be Israelis? Or you have to, by saying that all you need to do is say, I want equal rights and the world will come and help you? I said, when we were being killed daily, the world didn't come and help us. And we've been asking for our rights. Human rights, political rights, legal rights. I keep saying the right to self-determination is crucial to us as Palestinians. I want the right to my own history, my own land, my own culture. I want to live in freedom and in control of my life and resources. I don't want to be under the boot. That's why people here are much more not skeptical, hesitant about embracing the one, even though they know that the two-state solution is destroyed. They don't see how to get to the one-state solution. Because if it means just keeping the occupation as is and just asking for equal rights, you will lose all your land. The Palestinians of 48 owned over 90% of their land. What do they have now? Less than 3% of their land. The brain drain, making life impossible for Palestinians so they will leave. I keep saying Israel is not a neutral bystander waiting for us to have more children than they do and so on. It's not a demographic race. It's a question of rights. Huh? And my right is not going, look, the Palestinians in Israel are citizens. And yet they are second and third class citizens. And yet they discriminate against them systematically, systemically, and structurally, institutionally. Huh? And they legislate. And the moment they adopted the nation-state law that only Jews have the right to self-determination, they're telling all of us and everybody else that you do not belong. They're even willing to transfer. This is what we can talk about as demographic engineering. Transfer the Muthallath, the triangle and the north, and give them to the Palestinians because we don't want to taint the purity of our Jewishness with non-Jews and so on. This is very dangerous unless you have in place controls and protections for the Palestinians, for our land, for our lives. I don't want to see daily extrajudicial killings and executions. I don't want to see daily home demolitions. Daily, several homes are being destroyed daily. This is how they're carrying out an ethnic cleansing system. How do we get protection for the Palestinians who are under occupation? To me now, the question is, how do you curb Israeli violence and violations? How do you hold Israel accountable? How do you provide Palestinians with protection? We cannot jump and say, okay, no two states, one state, or no one state, two states. Let's just curb Israeli violations and Israeli land theft and theft of resources and total control over Palestinian lives and rights and devaluation of our rights and lives. And then we can work out solutions and different ways of looking at the outcome. And it shouldn't be, now we have to decide two-state or one. Now we have to decide how to put an end to it. Israeli captivity of the Palestinians, protect the Palestinians. Otherwise, if you leave them saying, stay where you are and just fight for your rights and struggle, ask for equal rights. We have in front of us the example of the Palestinians of 48 and the rights that they have. And I don't think that anybody treats citizens the way they do. The moment Ahmed al-Tibi said, for all, this is a country for all its citizens, they accused him of treason. What country does not want to be a country for all its citizens, a state for all its citizens? And Israel not only wants to has created an apartheid system, but it wants to get rid of the Palestinians in every possible way. So it's our job to maintain the Palestinians, maintain their resilience, provide them with anything that we can so that they can stay on the land. And then we will see. Then we have to mobilize. Then we have to get our own supporters and the solidarity movement and so on, and be able to get some curbs and limits to what Israel is doing to us. And we will put in place a plan or a program to achieve either. But I don't think you can jump from two states to one state and say that there is a ready-made solution. There isn't any. The conditions aren't right for either one. I'm sorry, I don't have more.
No, that was very clear. Again, I just wanted for you to express yourself. I'm just going to unmute Zaina for a minute if you wanted to speak. about your Jerusalem ID and also give greetings to your mother?
Oh my goodness. Actually, I cannot follow that. That was incredible. I mean, I've listened to my mom since I was a child. And I remember as a young kid telling everybody that we lent my mom to the peace process and we lent my mom to free Palestine. And it's an honor to be even on the screen with her, even though, you know, she's my mom. So I'm going to leave the conversation to end it with her comments. But I'm so proud of you, Mama. Like we say in Arabic, ترفع الراس, with words and with presentation and with your tireless work from my childhood to now. You're an inspiration. I'm so proud of you, and thank you, Mr. Hatem, for allowing me to be on. So grateful for the time. Thank you.
It's a big family, Palestinian, so it's really a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, it's nice. It's nice to hear from you, Habibti. And I'm sorry you lost your ID, and I'm sorry you can't be with us. I think they deprived us of having you and our grandchildren with us. That's something that really hurts. They know how to, you know, take decisions that separate families, they know where to hurt, frankly speaking.
And I have to tell you, Mr. Hatem, and sorry to interrupt you, Mama, but I think this is unprecedented because you have 3 generations. You have my mom, myself, and my son are all sitting here. My son and I are watching. We've been watching. So I think this is unprecedented for our family, and thank you for uniting us. the 3 generations.
It's a pleasure.
We do unite electronically.
They may have taken my ID, but I can assure you they have not taken away my Palestinianhood and my fight and my drive to keep working hard for Palestine. I come from a very special line of people who have worked tirelessly for decades to free Palestine, and we continue to do so with the inspiration of my mom and the Palestinian people, both in Palestine and everywhere around the world. So thank you so much for this.
Thanks, Habibti. Thank you. Hatem, that was a bit embarrassing.
No, that was a great. It's really a very important connection because I said began the personal and the political, the cultural, all these are connections that are very important. Sometimes as Palestinians, we have been, I would say we have been so political, which is again, because we've been engaged in major power politics for the past 100 to 150 years.
Yeah.
Sometimes we don't even stop to think about all the different ways about our culture, our heritage, our community, our family, the relations, the recipes that we have a major political struggle rests around falafel. Is it a Palestinian? Because now they're claiming falafel as an Israeli food.
Appropriation of culture.
Appropriation of culture. So even
we are possessive over falafel, tabbouleh, hummus, ufrike, and everything else.
So these are issues. Again, I'm thanking Zaina because I know that she worked with SJP, and to make all these connections, our conversations. You enriched us, Hanan, with your conversation.
Thank you, Hatem. Thank you for inviting me.
It's
a pleasure to be with you.
It's a pleasure. You know, your voice is very important and critical voice, and these are contributions because we always have to narrate history and to actually put our narrative out, because if we don't, then our narrative is often spoken to on behalf of. I often say that we're in a theater piece of our own lives, and we're asked to play a supporting actor role for Zionism and Western imperialism. And what we need is to actually be in our own, not only theater, but write our own narrative, right? Our own story, right? Bring all the people in our own encounters to really rethink and reimagine the future. So really thank you for your contribution.
And we make space for ourselves.
Absolutely.
And we do not accept the shrinking spaces that they're trying to put us in and to react to them. No, the more we speak out and the more we have personal narratives as well as political, historical, cultural narratives, the more people relate. And our humanity has always come through, really. No matter how much they tried to abstract us or dehumanize us, the Palestinians have stayed human, and that's absolutely important.
Thank you. Thank you, Hanan Ashrawi. I wish you the best. Wish you, for everybody in Palestine, the best. And for all those who are watching us, thank you. We have about 100 questions. So if we did not get to the questions, for sure, we'll have other encounters. And may we all join our hand and come to Palestine at one point. I do encourage people, if you are able to visit Palestine, seeing is believing. And if you can go on your own, if you can join one of the projects, one of the real decolonial and interfaith spaces, go and visit with the Palestinian community. I also encourage you to connect with the Christian Palestinian community in Palestine to understand, also for those who get so much demonization of the Palestinians, to make sure that we connect, because this is a very complex propaganda that we're dealing with on a constant basis. So I encourage people to actually engage, and I will also recommend a number of books. I have a list of reading lists on Palestine. We need to constantly educate ourselves. It's both building as well as challenging the narrative. Thank you, everyone, and bid you farewell.
Thank you.
Ma'as salama.
Thank you. Allah يسلمك. Allah يخليك.